Hello, welcome to this video event for Better Days 2020. My name is Catherine Kitterman, and I'm the Historical Director for Better Days 2020, a nonprofit that's focused on celebrating and amplifying Utah women's work in history. This year, 2020, marks 3 important anniversaries for voting rights, and we've been celebrating them and leading up to those anniversaries for a couple of years now, but 2020 marks the 150th anniversary of Utah women's first votes back in 1870. It also marks the centennial or 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment this August. And it also marks the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, which extended needed protections for voting rights for women and men of color. And we know that the struggle for equal rights in America didn't begin in 1870, and it didn't end in 1920 or 1965. It's an ongoing process and movement today. But we're really excited about the opportunity we have today to bring in distinguished scholars and historians and archivists who can talk to us about some of the women who worked in Utah for equality and equal rights before the law. To honor the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we felt that it was really important to highlight the work that women of color have done in facing legal and social discrimination, in overturning unjust laws, and in working to make their voices heard in our society. Historian Martha S. Jones wrote this year that the history of Black women and the vote is one about foremothers who set a high bar for the nation, past, present, and future. They have been a vanguard, claiming women's voting rights and leading by holding our nation to its highest ideals. Ever since Black women arrived in Utah, they have been working for equality and making a difference through education, community leadership, and more. And we're glad to have the opportunity today to hear about a few of these women. So we'll start off with Amy Tanner Theriot. She's an independent historian and author of the forthcoming book, Slavery in Zion, African-American Servitude in Utah Territory. Amy, why don't you tell us about one of your favorite Utah women?
While I was working to tell the story of the enslaved people in Utah Territory, I needed to work forward several decades to track the entire Black population of the territory to figure out who was who married whom, which people remained in the territory, which people left the territory. And in that process, I came across some other stories so compelling that they just stuck to me. Elizabeth Austin Taylor was one of those. Elizabeth Taylor arrived in Utah around 1890, and there she married William Wesley Taylor. They were a power couple. They operated on the intersection. If you drew a Venn diagram of the Black churches, politics, and the press, they were right in the middle of that. They were an integral part of those 3 communities in Utah. And they also operated across color lines. They worked with white political power makers. They worked with the white press. The Elizabeth and William Wesley, WW he was called, published Utah's Plain Dealer for about 15 years. It was one of 2 major Black newspapers in the territory and then state. The other was called Broad Axe, published by Julius Taylor, who wasn't related to them, and they were actually political rivals. Julius was trying to take the Black vote to the Democratic Party while the Taylors wanted to keep it with the Republican Party. And so they butted heads. It was an epic battle sometimes. Reading through the Broad Axe, you can tell that it was a battle. Very unfortunately, only one issue of Utah's Plain Dealer is known to survive, plus a few clippings. So we really only have one side of that battle to be able to show us that it was an epic battle, but we don't have a lot of what WW and Elizabeth wrote. We don't have the newspaper that she published after her husband died, and she took it up and published it for 2 or 3 more years by herself. And so the record that we have of her political involvement is from the Salt Lake Tribune, is from the other papers of the time, is from the Deseret News, and from the Broad Axe, from her political rival. But it tells a story of a woman who was out there working, getting out the vote, voting herself, running a newspaper, running her household. She had children, small children at the time, and she took care of them. She took care of family members, many extended family members. and she was also deeply involved in the churches. Her mother was a member of Calvary Baptist, and she and her husband were members of Trinity AME, and she and her husband helped establish Trinity AME and get those first congregations up and running. So really a compelling story, and of any period in Utah's Black history that could be made into a mini-series. I'd say 1890 to about 1910. Very fascinating period.
Thank you for sharing this. We're excited to learn more about Elizabeth from you as we move on today as well. Let's go to Taryn Mitchell. Taryn is an archivist at the LDS Church History Library and a subject matter expert in Black history in the LDS Church. And she's going to tell us about Lucille Bankhead. Taryn, what was she like and how did she contribute to Utah?
Lucille, well, her full name is Mary Lucille Perkins Bankhead. She has deep ancestry in Utah and in the church as well. She's descended on her father's side from the enslaved Green Flake, who traveled into Utah first before the rest of the pioneers to help set up the valley for his slave masters for when they arrived. She's also a descendant of the free woman, Jane Manning James, on her mother's side, who also traveled, was a member of the pioneer member of the church, and traveled to Utah with the rest of the church because of the persecution of the church. She lived in the Salt Lake City, or the Salt Lake area, her whole life. She was an active member of the church even when most of her family did not stay active in the church. Her husband, Thomas Leroy Bankhead, known as Leroy, who is also a descendant of an enslaved Black pioneer, Nathaniel Bankhead, would, even though he was not active in the church, he would drive her to church every Sunday and sit in the car and wait for her. She was not only active as a church member, but she was served as secretary for the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, and she was very influential, and so much that they asked her to give a talk, and it was being hosted at one of the hotels. But when she arrived at the hotel to give the talk, she was asked to go through the back door instead of the front door because of her color. So she had to deal with segregation and discrimination in Utah. And because of her leadership skills and how people looked up to her, when the Genesis group, which is a sort of support group for Blacks in the United States that are members of the church, she was formed in 1971. She was asked to be the first Relief Society president. And the group gave the opportunity for Blacks in the church to see themselves in leadership positions. And so she was very helpful for the community in that way, because she was seen as a leader among that group.
Thank you, Taryn. We're excited to learn more about Lucille and her work further on in the discussion here. Let's go now to Dr. Jackie Thompson, who recently retired from Davis School District as the director of the Educational Equity Department. She's received numerous awards and national recognition for work in multicultural education and human and civil rights, and she's very active in Utah here as well. So Dr. Jackie, can you tell us about the women that you're going to feature? What were they like and how did they contribute to Utah?
Wow, thank you, Ms. Catherine Kitterman. I'm excited to share with you today about Miss Mignon Barker Richmond, and I also will be sharing with you about Miss, there's two of them, and the second one is Mrs. Annabelle Weasley. And so I'll start first with Mrs. Mignon Barker Richmond. She was a prominent woman in Utah history, and her story is one of hope and courage and service and inspiration. And it's very meaningful because she was the first African-American woman to graduate from a college in Utah. And she served a lifetime as a human rights activist and community leader. Mignon, her name means Little Flower of Africa. And she was born April 1st, 1987 in Salt Lake City. Now, her parents were William Barker and Mary Alice Reagan Barker, and there was a unique story with her parents. Her mother was an English woman that was from London, and her father had been born enslaved in Joplin, Missouri. And he ran away and joined the Union Army during the Civil War when he was 18. And he became a drummer before he was captured and returned to his owner. He later escaped, thankfully, and eventually moved to Utah. And her parents were working, they met at a hotel where they both worked. And that's where they got married. Mignon, at the age of 13, she worked as a private housekeeper and soon realized that she wanted to do more with her life, and she graduated from West High School. And then she went on to attend Utah State Agricultural College, which is now known as Utah State University in Logan. And she refused to let racism stand in her way. There was one time where a professor told her, Mignon, you'll never get more than a C from me because you're a Negro. But Mignon showed him, and she leaped over those boundaries, and she stride forward and was an outstanding student, earning her degree in home living, textiles, and food. She began to continue to experience racism, and 27 years later, it would be 27 years later before she could actually work in her field, and we'll talk some more about that. I think what's so substantial is that Mignon started the first school lunch program in Utah, and that was exciting. She was very active in the YWCA, and she was very active with the Red Cross, and she also was a devoted member of the Calvary Baptist Church in Salt Lake City, and I'll share more about that as we go along. But in talking about Mignon, it's exciting, but I would invite you, once you hear about her, to visit her park, which is in Salt Lake City. Address is 444 East 600 South. So Mignon, we'll hear more about. I'm also excited to share with you about Mrs. Annabelle Weasley. And she was known as the Queen of 25th Street in Ogden. She was definitely a major force in Ogden's growing Black community in the mid-1900s, running the Porters and Raiders Club in Ogden for many years, because when the railroad porters would come through, they didn't have a place to eat, and they didn't have a place where they could stay. And so her husband, Bill, and her started this club, and it was a hotel as well. She helped to break down barriers facing African Americans in Utah, and she inspired people to make the most of her life, of their lives. She was born in Union Church, Mississippi in 1922 and was raised by her grandmother. But at age 10, I think you'll find this very interesting, she moved to New Orleans, Louisiana to live with her mother, Laura Brown. And Annabelle became very active as a student. And when she became leader of the local Junior Red Cross while in high school, she attended a convention. And at the convention, she had tea on the White House lawn with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Later in life, Annabelle was then chosen to introduce Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a prominent African-American educator and civil rights activist and advisor to the president, at the Junior Red Cross Southern Rally at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And so that was neat. I will be sharing more about how Annabelle came to Utah with her fiance, William Carter, who got a job at Hill Air Force Base. They were married in December of 1942. And so Annabelle never liked to ride on anyone else's coattails, so she worked very hard. And then shortly after that, that's when the Porters Club came into being, and we'll hear more about that as well, and the social barriers that she broke down. But Annabelle was a prominent woman, and we talk about all that she overcame and inspired others. And you remember her from the historic 24th Street in Ogden, Utah.
Thank you. I'm really excited to talk about all of these women together, but next we're going to have one last person introduced to us by Dr. Kathleen Christie. And Dr. Christie is a retired educator of 42 years. She served as a classroom teacher and an administrator, and her passion for educational equity has guided her career and accomplishments, which resulted in numerous awards and recognitions. So Dr. Christie, can you tell us about the last woman we'll be introducing today? What was she like? And again, what contribution did she make to Utah?
Okay, good afternoon or good evening or whatever time you're watching this. Hi, I'm Kathleen, and I am honored to present Alberta Henry. Alberta Henry is one of our more contemporary Utah women leaders. I actually knew her, had the opportunity to work with her. So when I was doing the research on Alberta Henry, I learned a lot that I didn't know, but it also confirmed for me what I did know. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She was a very small stature, feisty woman. She had a reputation in this community. And as I grew to understand more about her, she wasn't as intimidating as a lot of people thought. So let me give you a little background on her. She had this keen ability to sense what was going on. And that came from her childhood growing up watching her mother. She was born to sharecroppers in Shreveport, Louisiana. They later moved to Topeka, Kansas. And so as she was growing up, she was able to watch her mother interact in the community with others, and she learned a lot of her skills from watching her mother. She has often been described as being aggressive and authoritative and usually right, which she was, but I think she learned how to take those skills and make it work for her in her fight for equality. So again, as she's growing up, she had a lot of experiences in Topeka, and it caused her to begin to question what was going on. And taking those skills that she learned from her mother, the problem solving, listening, and addressing issues head on. She wasn't afraid to do that, but she did it with a sense of humor and wit. And that, I believe, is what caused her to go as far as she did in addressing some of the issues in Utah. She has, like I said, has a very popular reputation for doing what she did, whether people liked her or not. They knew she was right, and she had a way of convincing you that she was right. So yeah, I would love to share more information about what she did, when she did, here in Salt Lake City in the greater Utah community. But that's Alberta Henry.
Thank you. Definitely a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
And there's so much that we can learn from all of these women, from the skills that they used to solve problems and the way that they went about it, and from their determination and perseverance in tackling hard issues and keeping on going for long periods of time. So we're going to talk a little bit about what each of these women did to make a difference here in Utah, what issues they addressed and how, and what challenges they faced in doing so. And maybe we'll go back to Amy and talk about Elizabeth Taylor, since she lived the earliest of any of the women here. Can you talk to us a little bit about the issues she addressed, the challenges she faced, and what she did to overcome those and make a difference?
One of the greatest issues that Elizabeth Austin Taylor addressed in her work was the poverty, was the inability of the men in the families, the Black families, to be able to get steady, well-paying work. They were barred from education, from higher education, and from many of the fields that others were able to have access to. And so that led to a lot of instability within families. That led to a lot of, especially economic instability, with women needing to go out to work, have several jobs within a single family, and so children left unattended. And so she began an organization to address this and gathered women from throughout the Western United States to work together. At that time, the club movement was very popular. Women used clubs, whether they were literary clubs, religious clubs, political clubs, to get together, organize, get out the vote. And so she began several of these and was deeply involved in several of these to help start addressing some of those issues, to help start addressing segregation, to help gain political power. When she began her Western Women's Federation, the Western Federation of Colored Women, that met first in Salt Lake City. And the people that addressed that to start were Utah's governor and the mayor of Salt Lake City. She was building those networks to start getting access to power, to start bringing those issues to the forefront. And she also used the churches, trying to get education within the churches for children particularly, and make sure they were supported in their childhood so that they had stable lives. So that was really one of the most pressing issues to her, was that economic and that social stability within families.
Yeah, thank you. And you, as you said, she's really a woman of her time who used the club movement and used the bridges that she could build among different segments of society to make a difference. And I love learning a little bit more about her. Let's go to Taryn Mitchell and talk a little bit about Lucille Bankhead. What were the issues that she saw facing Black Utahns, or especially members of the church and the LDS church? What did she face in an uphill battle to change that? And what did she do to make a difference?
So just to give an idea of Lucille's character, whenever she saw anything or discrimination, or she would fight against it. As I mentioned earlier, when she wasn't allowed in the hotel through the front door, she fussed the staff out so much that they ended up just letting her going in. So she refused to let people talk down to her or talk down to anyone else in her community. One of the things that she fought for was for housing in Utah. Even though the Black community was very small, they were, as we said, her ancestors were some of the first of the LDS church to come in and set up the land. And so they also got some land near the farms of the slave owners and such. And a lot of the Black community was living out in Midville. Lucille Bankhead lived on Evergreen Avenue with a bunch of other Blacks of the community, the Lagrones, Sylvesters, and Perkins. And in fact, it was called Lower Avenue, or Lower Evergreen Avenue, that area where the Black families lived. So in the early 1930s, the United States was coming out of the Great Depression, and there was a lack of housing. And so Franklin D. Roosevelt created a new program called the New Deal to try to create new housing, particularly for white Americans. And as a part of the New Deal, there was a lot of laws that segregated where Blacks could live. There was redlining laws, which made it so that it would be harder for Blacks to get, or Blacks and people of color, to get loans to live in certain areas. And so neighborhoods became very segregated. In 1939, in Utah, Senator Sheldon R. Brewster advocated for redlining in Utah as well, which would mean kicking out all of the Blacks that were living in the Midville area to a less desirable area, which was on the other side of the railroad tracks. And when Lucille Bankhead got word of this, she, and I don't know if she organized it, but she got together with her crafting club. As Mary said, clubs were Amy said, clubs are very important back then. And she and her club with one of the Lagrone women that lived on her street with her packed up their children. They took a horse and wagon up to the State House. And she said it's her first time that she was ever been at the Capitol, and they sat in until the legislation ruled that it wasn't going to pass. And so she fought really hard to keep her and her housing where it was.
That's a really great story of persistence and lobbying, right? And making your voice heard. I love that. We'll come back to a little bit more about Lucille's story as well. Let's go to Dr. Jackie now, and we'll learn about Mignon Barker Richmond and Annabelle Weasley. What issues were they addressing, and how did they work to overcome the problems they saw in Utah's communities?
Great. Well, I believe the issues that they were both overcoming as we first start with Miss Mignon Barker Richmond was education. Both of them valued education. Mignon at the age of 13, realizing that housekeeping wasn't going to get her where she needed to be, going to attend Utah State in 1917 and then graduating in 1921. She faced that discrimination in education with her professor, thinking that she wasn't good enough to earn good grades, and she knew she could. She had high standards. And then she graduated in 1921 with a degree in home living, textiles, and foods, but it was 27 long years before she could work in her profession. And then it took her a year and a half after graduating from Utah State to even obtain a position as a housekeeper at the University of Utah. And so you could see that she was just not being used for her full talent. Uh, Mignon then went on later to work as a cook and a household manager until World War II broke out. And finally, during the war, they said, now wait a minute. Mignon Barker Richmond has great skills and talents that should be used, and she was recognized as a community organizer. She was hired as the senior director of volunteers for the United Service Organization and volunteered at the Red Cross and the YWCA and Women's Hospital. But still, again, she was facing discrimination, and she worked at the YWCA. And her friend Sylvia Durant remembers that they had a program for women that were working in the arms plant during the war, and that Mignon was in charge of the breakfast for the women coming off the night shifts. They would have been hungry. And so they went on a convention, Sylvia and Mignon, in 1956. And when they got to certain parts of states, Mignon had to leave Sylvia due to her race, Mignon being African American, and sit in the black car on the train. Mignon didn't let anything stand in her way. She was inspired by her mother, who believed in faith, courage, and determination. And so Mignon can even remember the time of when she was asked to use the servant entrance at a community event. And she had a great sense of humor too, just like Miss Alberta Henry. And she said, I'm just like Marian Anderson, the famous African American contralto who was required to use the freight elevator when she stayed at Hotel Utah. So Mignon was like, we're going to keep going over these hurdles and making it better for others that are coming along. She was a trailblazer in those areas as well. As we look at Annabelle Weasley, why Miss Annabelle Weasley, she faced a lot of discrimination too. When she first came to Utah with her husband at the time, who was, she did remarry again, but when she first came, Annabelle Weasley was not given housing. And so she felt it was hard to get housing in Utah. Later on, she would work hard to entirely to make sure that people would have housing. And so it was just amazing when she started to work at the Porters Club and the Waiters Club there in Ogden. She would notice that there were times when the police officers would come and they would not want the whites and the blacks to race mixed together. Her club was so popular that in the 50s, white Americans were coming over as well. And she told the officers, no, they're going to have the opportunity to come in because these doors are open. And I believe that everybody should be treated equitable. She knew the unspoken law was that that was not to happen, but she was courageous and she would stand up and she would help break down those barriers. And so that's what I thought was so neat about Annabelle, that she was opening doors that had been closed and permitting others to go through those doors.
Thank you, Dr. Jackie. Now let's go to Alberta Henry and Dr. Christie. What issues did she address specifically? What challenges was she facing, and how did she work to overcome those and make things better here in Utah?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, Alberta moved to Utah from Topeka, Kansas. And where she grew up in Kansas, it was a primarily Black African American community. So she went to Black schools, even though they were segregated. Her experiences were primarily within the Black community, the church, the schools, and the community centers. So when she had the opportunity to move to Utah, and that in itself is a long story, but she had gotten ill, deathly ill in Topeka, and decided to come and visit some friends here in Utah. Now, layered on top of that is the notion that Alberta felt that she was special. She was unique in the sense of she felt that the Lord was leading her, that she had had a vision that she needed to come to Utah. And so when she made that visit, she was only going to stay here 3 weeks, and she ended up staying here the rest of her life. So and when she came to Utah, one of the first things she noticed was that there was a small Black population here, and that there were not services for Blacks here. She couldn't find a barbershop, beauty shop, restaurants, schools, nothing, because of the small population. So with her keen sense of observation and her ability to connect people, she she couldn't get a job initially, because the only jobs at that time were the service jobs, as we heard described by Mignon Richmond. But she worked for a prominent Jewish family and lived with them, became very close to them. And that started some of her connections to helping her to address what she observed in the community. One of the biggest things she did, she learned about, or she recognized, the educational attainment of many of the Black students. Her love for children, she worked in Head Start, but when she started really getting out in the community and serving on boards and working with the Utah-Idaho Missionary Society and within the Pilgrim Baptist Church and Calvary Baptist Church, she started seeing all these issues around education. And she felt that is where she could land herself in terms of the work. So she, just started using her connections in the community with businessmen and some other prominent leaders in the community, and started gathering money for scholarships, because her concern at that time, again, was the educational attainment for Black students. And so she was able to raise money for scholarships for Black students. So that kind of started her off in really digging deeper into understanding what's going on here in terms of the education. Well, what she realized was that many of the Black students weren't finishing school, had low GPAs, and with her, again, her ability to problem solve and to get right into the source of the problem, she started the Alberta Henry Foundation, which it still continues today, where funds are raised for students, primarily low income students, but targeting Black students as well, to go to college. So, and because she wasn't college educated herself, she recognized that this was going to be a driving force for the Black students here in the community. When she became president of the NAACP, and she served in that office for 12 years, she recognized too that the voting issue was something in Utah. And I don't think she had any data, but it was just her sense of what's going on here. The Blacks here weren't registered for the most part. They didn't register to vote. So she started a drive through the NAACP to get the Black population here registered to vote. They didn't recognize it. So it was a different kind of voter suppression, right? They didn't have the education to know, or they hadn't known all the possibilities, their rights through the voting system. So she started campaigns for getting the Black residents here to vote. So those are two main issues that Alberta got herself involved in addition to the hundreds of committees that she served on.
Yeah, she did a lot. And as I'm listening to all of you speaking here, I'm thinking about how similar these issues were for many of them. Many of them were still fighting the same issues, right, in the 1890s to the 1960s or 70s with education, voting rights and participation, the need to lobby and make our voices heard in the Capitol, and also to build community that would help to support children and families, that would also be able to shape the way the future grows here in Utah. And each of these women did something in their own way. Not everybody has to be president of an organization or run for political office to make a difference. And I love that each of these women use their individual skills and talents and their knowledge to really dig in where they could make the best impact. There are lots of things we could talk about here, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how these women created opportunities for others. We've touched on some of that already, and maybe Dr. Christie, you'd like to go first here. Just how did Alberta work to create opportunities? You've mentioned that some before.
Okay, yes, as I spoke about the educational opportunity, she recognized that there was a need for the city, the district, the community to address the Black students in terms of their educational attainment. So she formed at the beginning, and when she connected with the school district, they hired her as a minority consultant, liaison to the community. And through that opportunity, she was able to create the Black Students Organization, which later became the Rainbow Society. It was a vehicle for encouraging Black students to raise their GPAs, to become interested in college. She worked closely with the University of Utah. She was actually a force for them to deal with, because her question always was, how come Black students are not getting scholarships? So she helped through that Rainbow Honor Society and her connections in the community with her friends. She's been called a community activist. I see her as a community organizer, a connector, and that's what she was able to do. So through raising the funds and working with the students, she was able to provide opportunities for them to go to college. And that's, that was a big issue for many of the Black students here in Utah in in those days, the 70s, 80s, and even up to the 90s. And with the organization still continuing, she provided those opportunities. Another way she provided opportunities was through her organizational work. She felt that if she belonged to, or she joined boards, her voice was going to be heard. And she felt that that was one way for the Black voice to be heard. So she would sit on many boards. And as I mentioned, there were up to 100 boards and committees that she served on. But she felt that was a need, and that provided opportunities for the Black voice to be heard in the community. And like I said, everybody knew who she was. Although many people were frightened or afraid of her coming to them, or when they heard that Alberta was on her way to meet with them, she didn't come in with a heavy hand. She would come in with an understanding and wanting to hear all sides of the story, right? As well as to help problem solve. What can we do to resolve these issues?
Thank you. Those are really great qualities and something we can all learn from as well. Let's go to Taryn Mitchell next and talk about Lucille Bankhead. What did she do to create opportunities for others, and how did she use her position to help other people succeed?
I believe, especially with her activism in the church and just her example in the church, she was able to show the Black members of the community a way in which to be a part of the church, but still maintain their identity as African Americans, because she would still fight and encourage church members to do the right thing. For example, and she would do it in her own gentle way. But for example, there was a lady that would come in on Sunday, and every time they asked her how she was doing, she would say, I don't remember the exact quote, but something to the effect of, "I'm as tired as a slave that's been working in the field all week." And Lucille Bankhead didn't say anything until one day someone asked her that question, and she said, well, I'm as tired as a slave that's been working in the field all week. And the woman overheard her, and she never said that again. So she did influence in her own ways, and especially with being a leader in the Genesis group, she was able to guide women and show women that their voices were valued in the church, even when the priesthood was not available to Blacks in the church. And one of the things that she kept saying is she always had faith that it was a mistake and that it would be corrected one day. And it was when in 1978, she went and did the temple work for her ancestor, Jane Manning James, who had petitioned the church while she was alive several times to get her temple work done. And her descendant was able to do that for her within the first weeks of the temple being open to Blacks. So her unwavering faith in the church also gave an example not only for Blacks in the church, but for the whites in the church, that the faith that their faith is not in the church but in God, and how her example really changed some of the mindsets of the members that were around her, especially the ones that went to church with her, and how they dealt with the Black community, and they felt it was an honor even to just have her in a ward and hear her testimony, and she was always bringing more people into the church and sitting with them and trying to make sure that they felt comfortable. So that's how she was a good example and showed her leadership in that way.
Thank you. I love those stories of how she used her voice. Dr. Jackie, let's go to you. We're going to hear about, again, Mignon Barker Richmond and Annabelle Weasley. What did they do to create opportunities for others and open up doors of possibility?
Great. So first I'll start with Miss Mignon Barker Richmond and what she did to open up the doors of opportunity for others. But her motto, you must know that her motto is, my life has been children. That's what she believed in. So everything she did centered around the children and what she could do to make a better life for them, leave a better world. And so with Mignon, she was married to Frank Smith in 1925, and when that marriage ended, she later married Thomas White Richmond on December 5th, 1933. But she had no children of her own. But Thomas White Richmond, he brought a daughter to the marriage, a young toddler named Ophelia. And she loved Ophelia so much. Her and Ophelia were very, very close. And as a result of that, she also took in all the children in the neighborhood, and she helped raise them too. She said and believed in the African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child. So she was always focusing in on what she could do to help the youth. Now, Mignon served for many years with the Salt Lake chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. And she helped organize events for the Black troops during World War II. She was the co-founder of the Nettie Gregory Center, and that was a gathering place in Salt Lake for minority youth groups to get involved in recreational activities. And with the Calvary Baptist Church, she did many things as well and created recreational spaces for the congregation youth and housing for its elderly members, and that housing is still standing today. Mignon served on many boards as well for the Utah Community Service Council and the Women's Legislative Council, and she was instrumental in developing anti-poverty legislation. So she was out there in the community, and she too, like Alberta Henry, believed that you had to be present at those tables to have a voice. I heard it said recently that Shirley Chisholm, who ran for the first African-American female to run for president, said, if you don't have a place at the table, bring a folding chair. These women didn't have to bring a folding chair. There was going to be a place at the table for them. When we look at Miss Annabelle Weasley, she also was very involved in the community. And after World War II ended, Annabelle, she divorced her husband William due to alcoholism. Him being an alcoholic, the disease of alcoholism. But she went on later in life to educate people in that area. And when she married Billy Weasley in 1947, and they opened the Porters and Waiters Club in Ogden, uh, Annabelle then experienced problems with segregation in Utah herself, and it took her more than a week when she first got there to find a place to rent in an overcrowded black neighborhoods of Ogden. When she first came to the state in 1942, that was happening. And she would not be accepted into the predominantly white neighborhoods, which we know later on, those doors were going to be open as well. So what Annabelle did was she remembered this and how hard it was for her. And she was an outstanding businesswoman. And she began to manage the Porters and Waiters Club operation. And she opened a lounge in the basement so that when these porters came through, they not only had a place to sleep at the hotel, but a place to eat and have entertainment. And in the basement, the jazz bands would play, and it was known as the finest black club in the West. And Bell brought in such famous musicians across the country as the Four Freshmen, B.B. King, Duke Ellington, and others. And then she often featured the local great jazz musician Joe McQueen and her were friends. And Joe McQueen played in her at her club for several years. Once this was known as a gathering, a meeting place for Black people, where they would have somewhere they could go where they felt that sense of belonging, because in other parts of the community, they did not feel that. In Annabelle's Porter and Waiters Club, in our churches, we would feel involved and included and valued, but not in the general population as of yet.
Thank you. I think it's really instructive how both Mignon and Annabelle learned from their own experience, remembered things from their own experience, and then tried to smooth the path for others when they were able to, things that have been difficult for them. I love that way of paying it forward. Let's go to Amy to talk about Elizabeth Taylor. What did she do that helped create opportunities for others?
I think Elizabeth's her efforts kind of fell into 5 categories. The first was, of course, her organizing. The women's clubs, as I mentioned before, whether that was the Lincoln Club, colored, as they called it, or literary clubs. Second would be the networking, making sure she had those connections to the people in power. In 1903, there was a national scandal because Senator Reed Smoot had invited the Black Republicans in the state to a dinner and had white women serving at that dinner. And the newspapers across the South and in the Midwest were just scandalized at that news. She and her husband, W.W. Taylor, are not named in that article, but that's who would have been there at that dinner. She was sitting there with the senator having those conversations. And the third was the Black press. And again, it's really a tragedy that we don't have Utah's Plain Dealer in existence anymore, because that gave Black people a voice. It provided the opportunity to write columns, to tell the stories about their social life, about to make those connections with the businesses in the community that wanted to advertise in the paper. And then the fourth way she created opportunity was religious, making sure those congregations were running, making sure the children in the congregations had opportunities. She had a really good way with children, according to some of the press. And so they liked being there. They liked being at her groups that she would put together. And then, of course, civil rights being really one of her most important legacies. Taryn has talked about Lucille Bankhead. One of the Bankhead histories mentioned the Taylors, W.W. and Elizabeth, and their long-lasting impact on some of those efforts that Lucille, she knew she could go up to the Capitol and sit there and do something. She'd seen, her family had seen Elizabeth and her husband doing that same action and having that impact on the community, having those conversations.
Yeah, so many ways that she blazed trails. And again, not just for herself, but for others in her community. I really love that. We're getting around to the last question I have for each of you. And so this is just, what do you find most interesting about these women? They can be the person that you've studied and written about, or one of the others that's been mentioned today. What do you learn from the examples and stories of these women that we've been talking about? Amy, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to go first.
The lessons from Elizabeth would be, go for it. Don't let anyone stop you. If you see needs, address them, talk to people, get them out there, do what needs to be done to make people's lives better. If families are under attack because of employment issues, because of social issues, again, get that out there, talk to people, make these networks, connect with the people in power, address it, put it in the press, put it out in the churches. That's the lessons I've learned from Elizabeth.
Thank you. Good ones for all of us to know about. Dr. Jackie, what would you say?
I learned so many valuable lessons from all of the women. And with Mignon, I learned with Mrs. Mignon Barker Richmond to never give up, that it was her faith in God that carried her through. I mean, she had some hymns that would just carry her through. I could just see her going around singing, count your blessings, count them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. That was one of her favorite songs. And trust and obey. And I think her faith in God took her a long way, but also her service to others took her a long way. She was not only known in Utah, but was also friends with Langston Hughes. And then she was also friends with Wallace Thurman of Salt Lake City. And they were part of the Harlem Renaissance. So her sphere of influence spanned here statewide, but also nationwide. She was kind to everyone, and she showed love and still remembered today, as was Mrs. Annabelle Weasley, because she too gave of herself. And she said, my goal was to help people see that they can do better. And so her legacy lives on when we think about the great impact. And I'll never be able to walk down the historic street of Ogden, 25th Street, and not think about Annabelle Weasley and how she gave back of her time, of her service, of her funding, and then went on to even serve on the Governor's Black Advisory Board. Her impact spanned in Utah, but throughout the nation, as people heard of the great Porters and Waiters Club that she had opened up so that others could be dignified and have a place to eat and to sleep. So she believed in feeding the spirit and the soul, but the mind also through education. But I would say that both of them would say, to God alone be all the glory, and that we can do great things when we work together and we serve others in our community and neighborhood.
Thank you. Taryn, what would you like to add to this?
I think just from hearing all the women's stories is what strikes me is the power of just one person, how one person's example can shape a community or change the path for a community that is struggling. And I don't think any of these women would be thinking so many years down the line, we would still be talking about what they did, but we are because of the powerful examples that they have set for us. And even if we don't have an army behind us or a large group behind us, we can still make a powerful, inspirational example with just the simple things we do, whether it's going to sit in at the Capitol or printing a newspaper or educating children. That's the small things that we can do can really change and impact the lives of others for years to come.
Thank you. Dr. Christie, what would you like to add?
Yeah, just listening to these stories, it just reminds me that it does only take one step, one person. And for many of these women, their strength and their courage to do what they did without any real role models, any paths in front of them. They just got out and did the work. So that's what I have learned. And with Alberta not being reactive, but responsive and addressing issues. I think I've learned a lot from her in terms of just being responsive and listening to people and trying to solve problems. Couple that with her faith and her belief that she was special and sent by God here to Utah. So this was a missionary field, and she called it that. But service to others, you know, this unselfish service to others and doing for others. And eventually it paid off for her. As I mentioned, she came here without an education, but throughout the course of her community work, her sitting on boards, working with the kids, she earned a bachelor's degree. Got an honorary doctorate degree from the University of Utah. But that's just how much she contributed to our community, to our state, and how well people knew who she was and what she was all about.
Thank you. Each of these women has shaped our state in so many ways. Utah is a better place because of the efforts of these women and so many others that we haven't talked about today, and women that we don't even know about and recognize. And it's our hope at Better Days 2020 that this year, as we're thinking about expansions of women's voting rights, as we're thinking about an election year coming up, that we recognize the power of our votes and our voices to get involved in our communities, and again to see what needs to be changed, and to be able to speak up and speak out and make that happen. I know I personally have learned so much from these women's examples that has inspired me to live differently and be a little bit more brave and courageous, and focus on what I can do to help others. And I really appreciate each of you for sharing your time and your insights and your expertise with us. Each of these women has written biographies of the women they featured, and those are on our website at utahwomenshistory.org. So you can see more about them, and there are lots of links to other resources as well there, so you can learn more. Are there any other last words, anything anyone else would like to add before we wrap up?
May I add one thing? That this year in April, Mignon, Richmond, her park now has a community garden. So the community came together to build a garden, a beautiful garden, and we look forward to going back next week because I'm sure the produce are going to be growing. So she planted seeds of love, and that love continues, and this garden is growing to nurture our community.
I love that visual representation of her legacy. Oh, please.
Can I add, and I'm encouraged by the young women that I see today. You know, they're taking up the mantle. They may not use the same strategies, but their courage and their boldness and their strength, I have hope that we will continue to move forth. But I'm just amazed at watching the young women today and their leadership.
Absolutely. And I think all Utahns, men and women, boys and girls, can really learn a lot from these stories, but we all have something unique and unique ways that we can make contributions to Utah. So again, if you want to learn more about these women and their stories, you can go to utahwomenshistory.org. You can see some beautiful illustrations that have been made of these women, and read more about their stories and find links to other resources to dig in and get involved in your own communities as well.